It's been a minute, hasn't it? Let's get into this.
Yo soy la madre, I'm the creator. Yo soy la reina, I am the maker. You can bow down now or bow down later. I don't need you to be my validator. I am the healer, la curandera. I'm starting fires, don't need madera. Deep as an ocean, light as a feather. Bring on the dragons, I am the slayer.
You're listening to Mom's New Identity Podcast. I'm your host, Amber Ivana, and on this podcast, we'll be discussing topics ranging from the realities and challenges of motherhood and raising a family, healing your inner child, and mental health, and last, but certainly not least, tips and education around business and productivity so that you can turn your passions and purpose into a full-time career. For those of you who have already been subscribed to my YouTube channel or maybe listened to my YouTube videos, you'll know that this podcast is really just essentially a continuation of what I started on YouTube. However, these podcasts are still going to be on video. So if you got used to watching me on YouTube, you can still watch me on YouTube, but you're going to see a bit of a different setup, me with these giant headphones on and this big old mic in my face. Where do I start? If you follow me on socials, you will know that I am a mom, I'm a wife. Maybe you saw me on TikTok, maybe you saw me on Instagram Reels, whatever. But I really am here creating this podcast for a very, very specific purpose. And I guess the mission here ultimately is a lot bigger than I think I've ever really alluded to. If you heard the intro, you'll know that the main things we're going to be talking about are motherhood, not just your basic, breastfeed or formula feed. No, I'm talking about the challenges and the realities of motherhood that I think a lot of us face, but are often too scared to talk about because mom shaming is a very real thing in today's day and age with social media and everything being online. So really, I just want to create a safe space for mothers to feel heard and feel validated and feel like, okay, I'm not alone in that struggle. Additionally, I want us to really address the topic of mental health, healing your childhood trauma, inner child work. I've, in the last year and a half, done quite a bit of work. I don't want to say I'm, an expert in that area. I'm not a licensed psychologist. So it's not like I'm here telling you what to do or anything like that. All I'm doing at this point is maybe sharing what's worked for me, and maybe, who knows, maybe it could work for you. So lastly, the thing that I think I've never really talked about, but I think is super important, is just business and productivity. And you'll understand why at the end of this, how that all ties into everything. But those are essentially going to be the main topics of discussion. I am looking at having some guests on the podcast, content creator friends that I've met along the way of starting my journey into content creation. Before we get into any of this intro, a little bit of background, the why, what we're going to do on this podcast, I want to explain the name, Mom's New Identity. So if you're a mom, you'll know that motherhood a lot of times can create a loss of self, a loss of identity, because you're this whole new person. And now you're a mother, now you're raising a whole entire human. And your life just takes a full 180. And everything that was maybe very important to you before isn't as important anymore. So it's almost like the old you before having kids, she's gone. Like, she's gone for good. And that sounds like really, maybe a little morbid, but it can feel that way. In all honesty, it can definitely feel that way. But I think that there's another aspect of our identities as mothers that is not often seen or talked about, and That's the identity that we associate with a good mother. What I'm trying to say really is that we have a loss of identity of who we are after having children. And then we have this idea of the identity that we should have. Let's put it that way, that we should have as mothers. And oftentimes we don't feel like we fit into either one. Or at least that's been my experience. Is I can't beat this mother, but also I'm not this girl anymore. Before having kids, that version of me is gone, and I don't want to necessarily go back to that. Yeah, there's pieces of it that I miss, but I don't fit into either of those boxes. So what now? Well, that's where the idea of creating a new identity that is true to you, that is authentic to you and your motherhood journey. Because we're all different. We're all unique. Our kids are all different and unique, and we all share different perspectives. So the name Mom's New Identity is really just I don't know if you would call it a term, but it's really meant to represent creating a motherhood experience that is true to you, that is new to maybe the rest of the world, but that feels right to you. So that's the story behind the name Mom's New Identity. So hopefully it makes a little more sense now at that point. Okay, but getting into it, this podcast, I never expected to be making a podcast. Never. Like, honestly, I didn't even expect to be into content creation at all. That's just kind of how things kind of ended up working out. I think where it really starts, the beginning of my story kind of starts in 2020 when I became a stay-at-home mother, and I was almost like, there was a piece of me that wanted to be a stay-at-home mother, but I was also open to the idea of going back to work, if I could put it that way. So ideally I could stay home with her because I thought that, oh, that's what a good mom does. You know, she stays home with her kids. And don't come for me because I don't believe that anymore. I think whatever a mom needs to do to provide for her kids, whether that means that she stays at home to save on childcare costs, to manage the household, whatever that looks like, or if she decides to work full time outside of the house, that's entirely on her. That's her business. Nobody should have a say in that except for the mother that's raising that child. So going back to it, I became a stay-at-home mother, and it was almost like an ultimatum for me. Like, I had no other choice. I was more or less backed into a corner because it was in the middle of the pandemic. There was little to no childcare. There was fear of getting COVID, my kids getting COVID, or I should say at that time, my daughter, because I didn't have my son yet. My daughter getting COVID at a very young age, being an infant. But ultimately, I was just in this place where I had no choice but to stay at home with her. And so that meant leaving my career at the bank behind for who knew, or God knew when, right? Like, I kind of had this idea like, well, maybe once I can wean her off, I can go back to work. And surprise, I got pregnant again. So there was that. I decided to let go of my banking career. And it was bittersweet. I'll definitely say that much. But I, after that, felt like I didn't know who the hell I was. And I realized so much of my identity, or what I felt like made me valuable or worthy, was my career and the work that I did. And I don't know that I've really let that go, if I'm totally honest, or that my value, I should say, I don't know that I've really let go of the idea that my value is directly tied to my productivity, just to be specific. And that hit me really hard. It not only put me into this really dark, depressive place, I was also struggling very much so with postpartum depression because I didn't get time away from my daughter because she just, she wouldn't take anything other than breast milk. I mean, when it got to the point where she had solids, it was a different story, but even still, she was attached at my hip. And that got really hard for me because I was the type of person that just needed to control everything around me. And here I am feeling like I have no purpose in life. I'm depressed, even suicidal. I'm struggling with money, living off the government. And I just didn't know what I was going to do. And then to add on to all of that, I found out I was pregnant. Right when I was ready to try and go back to work, I found out I was pregnant. And I don't like to say it was unplanned because I think I did definitely want another kid. It was just that I wanted it later, not sooner. I wanted to have a second kid a good distance of years apart, but I think it all worked out exactly how it was supposed to. So getting back to it, I just was at my wit's end and just questioning my existence. And when I finally shared with my husband that I was just feeling suicidal, that I didn't want to be here anymore, he was concerned naturally and told me that he wanted me to get help. And it was a good thing actually that I got pregnant because when you go in for your checkups, they have you do that test around your postnatal, perinatal depression, whatever. They have you do that thing to check if you're depressed or not, basically. So I filled it out. I was honest about how I felt about things. And that started my, I guess you can say, path into healing my inner child, working on my mental health. Because not only did I start to seek out therapy, I started looking more into how to heal. I found this really great book by Dr. Nicole LaPera called How to Do the Work. That was life-changing for me. Life-changing. I will throw this out there, though, that book was written by a white woman, so it's obviously going to be primarily in the perspective of someone who does not understand firsthand the realities and the struggles that people of color face and how it affects their mental health, how it can create even more trauma on top of whatever trauma they experienced in their childhood. So I just want to throw that out there. But for me, it was very much life-changing. And I read that book front to back, did all the exercises in there. It was super impactful. I started meditating every day. Not for a significant amount of time, maybe tops 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes a day. Or I worked up to that, I should say. I started journaling a lot. And between therapy, journaling, doing the work in that book, meditation, all of that, I really started to get in touch with who I really am. And what was crazy about that whole process is that when you start to break down your childhood trauma and the things, the coping mechanisms that you can take on as a result of certain childhood trauma, it's almost, I don't want to say mind-blowing, but it's crazy because you're like, oh, I just thought I was an overachiever. I thought I just was competitive, but really I was just seeking validation because truly deep down I didn't feel worthy because of whatever experience I had as a child. Oh shit. Like that was really what happened. So, I have this going on in my head and I'm like, what? And it was an interesting experience, but it was very liberating to start to break through some of the things that have been holding me back for so long. Like trauma really impacts every aspect of our lives, like mind, body, spirit, you name it, it's probably somehow tied to trauma. So I say that now knowing, or I'm in the process of reading the book, The Myth of Normal. Is that what? Yeah, The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabor Mate. I don't know if I said that right. I know I said his last name right, but I'm in the middle of reading that. It's a hefty book. Like it's literally this thick. It's as thick as a Harry Potter book. So it's going to take me a while to get through it. But if you go and you listen to some podcasts, he's on the On Purpose podcast. He's on the Man Enough podcast. If you just look up his name, he has TED Talks. He is very well informed on trauma and how it impacts us really as a society as a whole. So there's that, right? I started to do the inner work. I started to heal. I started to work on myself in a different way than I was always used to, because I was always used to, I think, the personal growth industry as a whole, or self-development industry, is very much about performance and wealth and financial success, but rarely addresses the need to heal the pain that is deep down, or it just rarely addresses any of that stuff, like mental health, anxiety, how that ties into everything. It's very much about once you perform, once you have the success, you're gonna be happy. And the reality is you can have all the success and money in the world and still be absolutely miserable, because at the end of the day, you still have to face yourself. You still have to look yourself in the mirror. You still have to be with your own thoughts. Nobody else can hear your thoughts. Even if you share what's on your mind, nobody else is truly in your mind. And so if you're not truly happy with the person you are, you're never going to be happy, despite how much money you have in the bank account. So for me, personal development, it's giving ick, as I say right now, as the Gen Zers. It's giving really, it's very much ick. I think that's how I say it. I don't know. I don't mean to mock anybody that uses that, like, legitimately. I do that because I feel sometimes a little silly talking like a Gen Z, because I'm a millennial. And I just feel like an old person trying on young slang, and it just feels awkward. So my only way to deal with that awkwardness is to mock it. So there we go. As I just mentioned, I think that was a really great lead into talking about this, is that I essentially I was at the start of all of this in poverty. I was living in poverty. And many mothers and children in this country are living in poverty. Specifically, single parent households that are also women of color are some of the most impoverished groups in this country. And the fact is, when you are literally just trying to survive, just trying to keep food on the table, you're not always concerned about whether or not you're healing your inner child. You're just trying to get through the goddamn day. And excuse my language, but you're just trying to get through the day and take it one day at a time. And the reality is that this country and the systems and the way that it operates is designed to serve a very certain group. It is designed to oppress people, period. It is. More so people of color just in general. You can disagree with that, but there is enough research and data to back that up. But it became painfully obvious to me how privileged I have always been. And I say that as a Latina. I am biracial. For those of you that don't know, my father is from Mexico. He came to the States when he was 10. My mother is actually half white and half Puerto Rican. But also, I've had this experience of living in poverty and knowing, damn, if it's this hard for me, I can't even imagine how hard it must be for a Black single mother in America. Right? And while I can't solve all the issues with their country by myself, I know that many of us women have this level of strength within us, especially if you're a mother, because a mother who loves her children, and unfortunately there are mothers who do not, so that's why I say a mother who loves her children, will move mountains and break barriers for her children. And I think that's one of the amazing qualities of becoming a mother, is that you tap into this often underutilized and underestimated level of power and determination that you were not previously aware of, because I think we all have it in us. If there's a force on this earth that is powerful enough to foster change in this world, it's love. It is a love we have for ourselves, for the people in our lives, and our willingness to protect them and do whatever it takes to protect them and uplift them. And I only am one person, obviously, but my hope is that as I share with you all the realities and the struggles of motherhood, it will help you to feel seen and validated and not feel so alone and defeated. When I share some of the things that I have learned and experienced along the way of healing and learning to work with your triggers and seek the resources needed to overcome those things that are holding you back from being the version of you that this world needs. And lastly, as I share these tips on business and productivity, the reality is that the world we live in, the country, not the world, but the country in the United States that we live in, runs and operates and is centered around money, unfortunately. And until that can change, we have to accept the fact that sometimes you can't beat them, you got to join them. And I don't mean it in the sense of corporate greed or just, stabbing people in the back to get to wherever you need to be. I mean, taking advantage of the system. My intention is not to get you to become this hyped up, like, oh, I'm all self-improvement and da-da-da-da. No, that's not my goal. I don't want you to burn yourself out, because I think as a mother, you probably already have a lot on your plate. I think that really my goal is to help you understand the system that is designed to keep you in poverty, because that's really what it is. And if I can just tell you a little bit about what I know when it comes to business, or what I've learned. I started out in one of the major banks, and I started out as a teller. I worked my way up to becoming a banker. And in all of that, I had to learn about credit. I had to learn about just the general function of the financial systems and mortgages, car loans, gosh, all that stuff. And then for a brief period, handful of years, I left banking to go into the investment industry. And in there, I learned a lot more about the different tools and investing tools, I should say, and really strategies, I guess you can say, that people use to build wealth. And in addition to that, learning about really business and how it operates, that was actually that knowledge of the financial aspect of business and how to run a business actually came when I left the investment industry and came back to the bank, where they had me in a role that involved helping business owners. So I really had to understand the different types of businesses. And I've always been hungry for knowledge. I've always been a very studious person. I was called a nerd back in middle school because I just was always the one trying to learn and raising my hand and getting straight A's. And it sucks that being smart was not cool back then, but I'm so glad that it's serving me now as an adult. Let's just put it that way. So knowing really the financial system, how it operates, the banking system, credit, the financial aspect of owning a business, that is relevant because my goal is to give you the tools and resources and information that you need to possibly get into business for yourself or change your financial situation. Now, I was listening to a really great podcast by the Financial Feminist. I love her so much, and I really hope that one day I am able to meet her and possibly be on her podcast or have her on mine. I don't know. That's just maybe, it's not a pipe dream. It's going to happen one day. Okay. It's going to happen. I'm calling it out. I am manifesting that. She makes a very good point, and it's in her book, which I have to go out and read. She makes a very good point that you cannot budget your way out of poverty. You can't. You cannot budget your way out of poverty. And I, for a long time, because of the influences I had, because I was in the personal development industry for a very, very, very long time, I should say influenced by them, that if somebody's poor, it's their own fault. If you could see my face right now, you would just see that I'm making this face like, okay, then. It's very classist to say something like that. Like, oh, if you're in poverty, it's your own fault. And for a long time, I really did believe that, until I started living in poverty and realized how quickly it happens. Because once you have kids, the government says, all right, fuck you. You're on your own. Like, literally. But what's crazy is that they want us to have babies because they need a working class. And so they don't say, hey, how can we make it more beneficial or encourage people to start having more kids? Well, why don't we force them to get pregnant? Oh my gosh. As much as I don't want to go into politics, I'm not going to stay silent on this. So if you're already turned off, goodbye. Good riddance. Because this stuff is important. It is important because there's literal lives on the line when it comes to these things. Literal lives on the line. And if you don't see it that way, fine. But I am going to talk about so-called political issues But the fact is, if these issues are impacting the way people are able to live and whether or not they can live, it's not a political issue. It's a human rights issue. It's a human issue. So I'll get off my high horse. No, I'm just kidding. I'll get off my, what do they say? I'll get off my soapbox now. But really that is my goal in this podcast, is to help mothers unpack some of the biases and really lies that they have been told of what a mother should or should not be doing, how she should be raising her kids, this and that. Empowering you all to seek out help or resources to start to heal. Because so many of us mothers are the default parent, which means that we have a very big influence on our families and how they operate. And when we are happier, when we have found our own peace and have an immense amount of self-love and self-worth, that radiates through and overflows into our children, into our families. It's extremely important that our healing ourselves becomes a priority, because that's the only way that we are going to prevent pain in the world from passing down to further generations. And if you're a millennial, I know you feel me on this. Millennials, we are cycle breakers. Let me tell you, we are cycle breakers. And lastly, of course, the business and productivity tips, because I want you all to find success. I want you all to find financial peace. And I think that if we can step back into our power and take power back into our own hands as some of the most impoverished groups in this country, then the world is going to change. We have so much impact on those around us. But it starts in here. It starts within us. So if any of this resonates with you, or you feel like, oh my gosh, I cannot wait to join this podcast and join this movement, good. I'm glad. And I have some stuff for you. I am actually I'm in the midst. It should be done here very soon by the time this podcast is released. I'm going to be releasing a free guide that is going to be more or less a questionnaire to ask you, or I guess almost a self-evaluation of your mindset around your motherhood experience, your mental health and healing, and kind of maybe what some of the things you struggle with, as well as your purpose, your passions. Because I can tell you this much is when, it sounds so cliche, but honestly, when you are super passionate about what it is that you're doing, if you feel it is your purpose, nothing is going to stop you from becoming successful in whatever it is that you do. Like, I feel very deeply about helping and serving mothers because of the impact I know that they have on the rest of the world. And it's because of that I'm still here. I'm still showing up. Even though I don't have hundreds of thousands of followers, or even thousands, to be quite honest. I'm not even there yet. But that doesn't matter to me, because I know that this work is important, and I believe it so deeply that I'm not going to stop until I've impacted enough people's lives. And I think that the universe, that God, rewards that kind of thing with whatever sort of monetary gain that may be necessary to further the movement, I guess you can say. Like, at the end of the day, money is a tool. And so when money is in the hands of people who have their heart in the right place, literal miracles can happen, right? Like, ultimately, what is going to have to happen in order for me to further help and empower some of these women, mothers, is coaching really. And I'm not quite sure I have the capacity for that just yet, but it's definitely in the works. And so overall, I've got a few resources for you. I've got my self-discovery assessment guide, if that's what you want to call it, that's going to help you really gauge where your head is when it comes to your motherhood experience, your mental health, and last but not least, the things that you're passionate about, what fuels you, what motivates you, and how you can maybe leverage those skills and passions into a career or even a small business that will give you the income that you need to be able to help provide for your family, to invest into whatever causes you need to, communities, charities, all of that stuff. So until next time, these podcast episodes, like I said, are going to be bi-weekly. And I do plan on having friends of mine, maybe other creators that I've met on this podcast, just to share their experiences with motherhood, with pursuing their passions and careers, as well as really just starting to heal and work on their trauma. And in doing so, my hope is that the voices of people who maybe you can relate to, because not everyone's going to relate to my experience, will inspire you to do what you need to do to become the best version of yourself, so that we can all, as a group, start to pour into our children, our loved ones, and ultimately make this world, make this country a much better place to live in. So with that said, thank you for listening, and I can't wait to talk with you in another couple weeks. Okay? Have a good one. Mom's New Identity podcast is written, directed, and produced by your host, Amber Ivana. Intro music, Madre Creator, is written, produced, and performed by Heidi Rojas Music.